This is George Gruhn, Gruhn Guitars, here to talk to you October 23rd, 2020. It's been an interesting time in Nashville. We just last night had the last of the presidential debates, which were more decorum than the previous one. But I personally doubt that either of them changed very many votes, but it was great for Nashville to have it and for the event to go on and go smoothly. We've got plenty of reader questions for today, so I'll just plow right in. Gary asks, is there a guitar in Martin's lineup that has the same specs as the OM42, but without all the bling? And the answer is that Martin does make a variety of OM models. The one that would be the closest in their standard lineup would be the OM28, which is the same size, same shape, the same bracing pattern, less bling, herringbone trim, but is a nice guitar. And from the standpoint of playability and sound, would be in many ways the equivalent guitar. It is, as I said, the same size, same shape, same bracing pattern, same wood, so there's no particular reason to expect it to sound especially different, and certainly costs much less. No fancy pearl trim on the front or on the neck, but still a very good guitar. Dave King, could you discuss lacquer cracking on the early Corona D55 Guild guitars after they moved in 2001? Is there any issues with the bracing and bridges of these models? It seems like the finish cracks wave out from around the corners of the bridge. The Corona factory was where Fender had been making electric solid body guitars and basses. And when Fender bought Guild, they got with it the factory in Westerly, Rhode Island. That factory was a building that was built turn of the century, like circa 1900. A lot of the equipment was out of date. Certainly no CNC, computer numeric controlled equipment, but they were set up for lacquer finishes. Fender put quite a bit of money into that, but eventually they decided that they'd move it all, close down Westerly and just move it to Corona, California, where they were doing their electric guitars. My personal opinion is that was a mistake because the Corona factory had never sprayed lacquer at that time. They were just doing poly finishes. And the Guilds made in Corona typically were poly finishes. At any rate, they had a lot of quality control problems of all sorts. And in general, the Corona model Guilds bring less money than those made previous in Westerly, Rhode Island. After a few years in Corona, they gave up on that and they purchased the factory at Tacoma Guitar Company. They took over Tacoma and they moved production to Tacoma, Washington. And that factory also hadn't been set up for lacquer. And that was very problematic. So they had lots of quality issues on finishes done there. Later again, they moved production of Guilds to New Hartford, Connecticut, to the old Ovation factory. And that was another boondoggle, which was unprofitable. And later yet, they sold it to the current owners, who are set up now in California making Guilds. But the Corona Guilds in general are just not as highly regarded. On the other hand, if you find one that's in good condition, sounds well, plays well, and hasn't given any particular problems, there's no reason not to get it. Because if it was going to have problems, it would have had them by now. If it's still structurally stable, it ought to be a good guitar. But Guild started out in New York City, and they moved across the river to Hoboken, New Jersey in the 60s. And then 67, they moved the operation to Westerly, Rhode Island. So it's gone from New York to Hoboken, New Jersey, to Westerly, Rhode Island, to Corona, California, to Tacoma, Washington, and then it went on to New Hartford, Connecticut, which was 62 miles away from Westerly, Rhode Island. And now it's back in California. So you could write a whole master's thesis probably on how not to run a guitar company by examining the history of Guild, and I'll leave it at that. Jackie Ezel asks, why do you think the older Martins are so much lighter than the new ones? Is it just age, or is the wood drying different because of mass production? Well, the difference in weight that is going to be lost from the time a guitar is made till the time it's well seasoned, when it's a fully constructed guitar, is very, very minimal. If there's a difference in weight, it's because they were built lighter, thinner wood, and in some cases, lighter weight wood. For example, mahogany, depending on the growing conditions, can vary very considerably in weight. The sinker mahogany that we use on some of the custom shop Martins that I'm featuring at my shop typically have wood. The mahogany weighs a bit more per cubic foot, but not dramatically more, but it does actually respond quite differently than the wood that has not been seasoned underwater so long. But a lot of it is because it's not even the seasoning underwater, it's the fact that this wood was cut in virgin forests that were dimly lit, and they were doing that harvesting between 1880 to 1900, so 140 to 100 years ago. And those trees grew slow. The wood was dense. It's just like spruce. If you use lumber that is grown on a tree farm, like 2x4s for pine, some of that pine may have 3 or 4 grain lines to the inch that's grown in a tree farm. It's good for paper pulp, but structurally, if you make 2x4s out of it, it's nowhere near as strong as wood that grew in a forest and has 20 or more lines to the inch. So you can have a 2x4 that has a strength for, if you test it in the lab for the breaking point, the forest wood can be twice as strong. Or if you're in a building, in fact, I have a friend who's a retired president of a structural engineering company, and he's worked on some old buildings where they can test and they can find that the wood that is in some of those timbers for support beams is twice as strong and can be smaller dimension, but still have the same strength as if you bought wood at most lumber yards today. So it's not just the dimension of the wood beams that you use, but it's the strength of the wood that you use, and it can be the same species. But typically, getting back down to it, some of the Martin guitars, particularly Martins that are made in the 1920s and earlier, they're much lighter weight construction, but a lot of those guitars were designed for gut rather than steel strings. So if you get into the mid and late 30s, a lot of the Martin guitars, you can weigh a D28 made in 1937, and you can weigh a new one, and they're not all that different. But if you get into guitars from the 20s and earlier, they are much lighter. but it's definitely not simply a matter of drying. It's construction and what they weighed on day one. Thomas Van Tilburg, when this virus stuff is over, I will be doing a lot of traveling overseas. Can you recommend me a travel guitar? Well, I guess there are two considerations if one is thinking about a travel guitar. One is if you're traveling where you're going to be going, suppose you're a working musician and you're going to be playing in Brazil one day in a city that's in the middle of a tropical rainforest, and the next day you're taking a flight and you're going to be in Telluride, Colorado, where it's bone dry. Well, if you want that, you might want to consider something like a carbon graphite guitar that has virtually no wood on it, or not virtually, it may have no wood on it on some of those. McPherson makes graphite guitars. It actually plugged in, at least. It's an acoustic electric, but it's an acoustic guitar. It just has a pickup and plugged in. It looks pretty good. It sounds very good plugged in, very serviceable. You can be in dripping wet one day and bone dry the next, and it won't go out of adjustment. And it can be heated up to 140 degrees in an oven and keep it there for a week and nothing bad happens to it. And you can take it to -40 Fahrenheit. Actually, at -40 Fahrenheit and centigrade are the same. It's where they cross. But it can go to that and nothing bad happens to it there either. But that's one consideration for a travel guitar. Another is legal considerations. If, for example, you have a instrument that's made with Brazilian rosewood and has ivory nut and saddle, or some of the early Martins even have style 30 on up, have solid ivory bridge. Well, that can be really problematic. If you take that out of the country, it could be confiscated. And Brazilian rosewood, unless you have a permit for it, can be a real issue in travel. For that purpose, there are plenty of guitars made today that are no problem at all. If they're mahogany with a spruce top and Indian rosewood ebony or ebony bridge and fingerboard, you're not likely to have any problem traveling. But if you're taking a high-end vintage guitar or even a modern guitar that has Brazilian rosewood, that rosewood may be legal and it may have a permit for the maker. But if you don't have the right paperwork, you could have problems. So what I'd recommend there is there are numerous makers that are building nice guitars with Indian rosewood rather than Brazilian rosewood, no ivory, and you should not have any problems. But I would not take a good pre-World War II Martin style 21 on up. It's Brazilian rosewood, back, sides, peghead veneer. So that's a consideration. But there are plenty of guitars that should be no problem at all to travel. In fact, most modern guitars are really not going to cause you any grief traveling with them. But be cautious on things that have Brazilian rosewood and ivory. A question from John. Does sinker mahogany go through a drying method like torrification? If it is torrified, I'm wondering if Martin has experimented with the vintage tone system on the current Honduran mahogany with success. Could the two be very similar? The answer is that the sinker mahogany is already aged 100 to as much as 140 years. There would be absolutely no reason to use torrification on it. It does get kiln dried, and even after that needs additional seasoning. So it does have to be dried because when it's pulled out of the river bottom, it's wet. But when you cut a tree in the forest, it's a live tree. And in the tropics, there's always sap in that tree. Now, for spruce, pine, usually that's cut in the winter when the sap is down. And that's a different matter, but you still have to season it before you can really use it well. But there is no need for torrification, no incentive to do torrification. As far as I'm concerned, there's never a need for torrification because that's just something that is artificially trying to age the wood, but it results in wood that is more brittle. And Martin has done some experimentation with mahogany and other wood for back and sides, trying torrification. And the general finding is it makes it rather brittle, almost impossible to bend sides that are torrified. I know that Stephen Gilchrist tried a piece of torrified spruce, and as soon as he put a chisel to it, it shattered almost like glass. He couldn't carve it. You can cut it on a CNC machine. But so far as hand carving it, not good. And there's so far no Martin guitars offered with torrified wood, mahogany, or other wood for back and sides. They have used it on Adirondack spruce and on Sitka spruce. And those are the only woods that Martin has so far offered torrified. It is not my personal favorite stuff, which I've discussed on numerous occasions, but I feel that it is physically more brittle and the harmonic response is, in my opinion, somewhat pinched off and just not the same. I prefer the sound of naturally aged wood. Jeffrey. Someone sends in pictures and a description of a guitar for appraisal. You give them a value, say $1,000. Let's pretend that same person lived in the same city as you and brought in the guitar in person. You can see the guitar and also play it. Is it possible that there would be a difference in value due to the ability to hear how the guitar sounds in person? And if so, do you think it could be significant? With world changing now with the world changing now due to the COVID-19 virus, do you think that it would ever be possible to do a sound check of a guitar remotely with the appropriate setup, i.e. not an iPhone, but real microphones, etc.? First, I will say that there certainly is a difference between doing an appraisal in person versus from photos only. There are many things we cannot judge from photos. For one thing, we can only see what's in the photo. If there's a defect that doesn't show up in the photo, we're not going to find it. If the neck is warped, we're not likely to see that in a photo. If the neck has a twist in it, we're not going to see that in a photo. If the truss rod in a neck has been broken and is non-functional, but would be very expensive to repair, we won't see that in a photo. If the bridge is coming loose, but is not dramatically off, but it's just barely enough to slip a little palette knife under it, we don't see that in a photo. If it has loose braces, we don't see that in a photo. And any photo we do based on photos clearly states that we only are examining the photos, and it is good only insofar as what we see in the photos is indeed an accurate picture. If we see one in person, it is examined very carefully, and we do effectively the complete forensic exam. But we're still not necessarily judging it on sound. And when we appraise a guitar, we're interested primarily in the make, the model, the age, the cosmetic condition, its structural condition, and the degree of originality, if it's been highly reworked, if it's refinished, if it has a replacement neck, if it's been badly refretted, every bit of that is taken into account. We're interested in the rarity of the model, although rarity alone does not necessarily mean that it's worth a lot of money. Some items that are rare because ain't nobody ever wanted one like that. Just like some custom one-of-a-kind instruments. Yes, it was made that way for somebody, but nobody else ever wanted one like it. Some models were just commercial failures when new, but later were highly sought after, like the lower F5 mandolins made from 22 through 24 by Gibson, or the Explorer Gibson and the Flying V Gibson made 58 through 59. But a lot of those things do not necessarily go by rarity alone. It's desirability. Does a famous player use them? Does it have a reputation for being a great guitar? Some models have reputations for really being great. They're highly sought after. And just Sunburst Les Paul Gibsons, they made close to 1,500 of them. There are other models that they made far less of, but Sunburst Les Pauls bring a whole lot of money. And Flying V's and Explorers also bring a whole lot of money, and they're very rare, but they did go on to influence a lot of people. So that even though the original first issue V's and Explorers were commercially unsuccessful when new, they were too avant-garde at the time, they influenced a lot of instruments made later, and the originals are now very sought after. But when it comes down to sound, sound is rather subjective, but none of the things that I use when appraising a guitar are directly based on the sound of one particular instrument. It may certainly affect its desirability for me, but even sound and feel can be subjective enough that I've had guitars that somebody can pick up and say they don't like it at all. The next guy comes along and just falls in love with it, and they may both be very good players. So it's rather fascinating that when it comes right down to it, sound alone does not dictate appraised value. In fact, it plays very little role in it. But the reputation of the maker and the model for good sound and good playability is critical. And that reputation would not be there if that maker really didn't have instruments that were very good. So there's hardly any instruments that have extremely high value and are rotten sounding. Typically, if it is something like a Martin pre-World War II D28 and it doesn't sound good, you can examine it and find out what somebody did to it to cause that, because it probably has some defect that happened after it left the factory. And it's likely to be bad previous customizing. At any rate, the other fact I'll say is that you can take a stinko sounding acoustic guitar and in a studio setting, if it's set up where it has accurate intonation and has reasonably good balance, you can twiddle the knobs and make it sound pretty good in a studio. And guitars that record really well are not necessarily the guitars that sound the best to the human ear. A lot of times dreadnought guitars and sometimes rosewood dreadnoughts have too many overtones and too much boom to record easily in most studio settings. And then there's even recording technique. One of the greatest violinists of the first half of the 20th century, Jascha Heifetz, never wanted a microphone closer than 10 feet from him for recordings. And when you see microphones with a symphony orchestra, they're not right close to the instruments. They're way up, and they're there for recording. They're not for amplification. So recording technique makes a big difference. But when it comes down to it, do I want to listen to recordings of guitars to do appraisals. The one-word answer is no, and the longer answer is absolutely no. Mike Gauff, on semi-hollow electric guitars, what body woods or laminates produce the deepest, bassiest sound unplugged? Typically, what type pickups capture and transmit the richness to an amp? Well, the ones that would produce the greatest resonance would not be laminated, but would be solid wood construction. But on a semi-hollow guitar, there's not much that has solid wood construction on semi-hollow guitars. That's ES335 and 345, that type of the Fender hollow body Coronado series. They don't have solid construction on a semi-hollow. And the semi-hollow Collings guitars, I believe, are also laminate. DeQuisto did a few thin line hollow electrics. They were typically hollow, but he did some that were laminate wood. I guess we can say, though, that even for the laminates used on the ES330 and 335 model Gibsons, some of the laminates they used in the 1950s were actually a bit thinner and fewer plies and sounded a bit more resonant. One of the few semi-hollow guitars I know of that is completely solid wood construction. I'll take me about 3 seconds to just grab one. Here it is. This is the Gruhn design Avatar model. And this one has a solid spruce top, mahogany neck and back, ebony fingerboard, and it is solid under the pickups, but it does not have a solid block going all the way down. It's just solid under the pickups, but even from the bridge and all around it, that's all hollow. And we offered this same type guitar with maple top or spruce top. The one I just showed you has double coil Filtertron type TV Jones pickups. We also offer it with humbucking pickups, typically the Seth Lover Seymour Duncan pickups, but we can put any kind of pickup on them. But that does have considerable acoustic resonance, but you can crank it loud. And it's a very versatile guitar. But as far as which type pickups produce the sound best, again, this is a matter of personal preference. 335 Gibson has humbucking pickups. The 330 had single coil. We offer the Gruhn models with 2 different type pickups routinely, and whatever else the customer wants, we could offer it. But any really good quality pickup will pick up a sound that is directly related to the string vibration, because a pickup functions not like a microphone, but like a generator. You have coils and magnets, and if you vibrate a string over that, it produces a weak electric current that is directly proportional to the vibration pattern of the string. So all the harmonics, the dominant, everything in that vibration pattern is reflected in the electrical signal, which then goes through the cord to an amplifier, which amplifies the signal enough to drive an electric speaker. So which pickup is best? There are different pickups that have their own particular type sound influence, but every bit of it is still directly related to that string vibration pattern. So guitars that have a good acoustic response, that sound good to your ear, even if it's not loud, on a solid body electric guitar, customers still play them acoustically and listen to how vibrantly alive it is or is not. And they make purchases often based on that. So that is a significant consideration. John S. Parent walks in and says, my kids want to learn how to play the guitar and I don't know diddly. What advice do you give the parents? Size, electric, acoustic, book, or teacher? Well, a lot depends on not simply how much the parent knows, but how much the kid knows, how old that kid is. You know, if you want your kid to play electric guitar and the child is under 10 years old, in all probability, a lot of those parents actually do know something about music, and they may already have notions about what they would like for their kid to have. But if the child is 15 years old, that's a whole different question. They probably already have an idea what their musical preferences are, what kind of sounds will interest them, who their favorite performers are. And if they're into heavy metal, then they're probably not going to be happy starting out on an acoustic guitar. But again, it depends what the child is interested in, what kind of music the parent and the child both like. The older the child is, the more the parent better listen to what the kid wants, because otherwise it's like trying to select a boyfriend for your girl or a girlfriend for your son. It's not a great idea to do that. Let them play a role in it. But for a young child, it's easier to start on an acoustic guitar because you don't have to get an amplifier. Because if you're going to get an electric guitar, you also have to get an amp, and the amp can cost as much as the guitar. Fortunately, today, student model guitars, inflation adjusted, to get something that's decent, are much cheaper now than they used to be. And that is somewhat of a blessing. But back in the 60s, 50s, Harmony and Kay guitars were quite expensive, and they just really weren't all that great. Today, you can get import guitars. Some of even the Indonesian and Chinese guitars are quite good. A lot of the Korean guitars are pretty darn good now, especially when there are major companies like ESP or Fender, or some of the Gibson instruments, Gibson Epiphones. Some of those are quite good. And there are dozens of brands that actually are good. So you can get acoustic or electric guitars. It should be, at least physically, a size that suits the child. And if a child is under 10 years old, it likely is going to be something that's not a full-size guitar. But there's Martin mini guitar, and there's Taylor GS Mini. They're good for a lot of kids, and they're good enough guitars. They can be played beyond just little kids, but they're still small enough. Full-size dreadnought guitar for a 6-year-old child is not going to work. Can't hold it. But most electric guitars are manageable enough even for a child. There's a company, Loog, L-O-O-G, that makes guitars specifically designed for children, 3-string. They have a small enough neck, And some of them even have a built-in amplifier, or else there are some amps that are cheap enough too. So there are things like that that a kid can start on. Also, kids can start on a ukulele, and the basic fingering is the same as on the first four strings of a guitar. So you can learn a lot on a uke. But so far as books and teachers, it's good to have some instruction, especially if the child has some idea what he wants to learn. But I think it's important to have a teacher who will start them out quickly to learn how to create music, how to pick out tunes by ear, and not start simply with a year's worth of finger exercises and music theory. Yes, music theory is important, and yes, we want to have that. But I think to get a child's attention and interest and have them continue to learn, you really need to show them quickly that they can play something that is like a recognizable tune and that it's not overly difficult. And then after that, they can spend a lifetime learning more. But you got to grab them at first, and you have to give them a guitar that is physically easy enough to play, and it sounds good enough that it's not irritating to listen to it. And fortunately, there are plenty of such options. So far as book or teacher, a book alone doesn't do it. You really need to have, if not a teacher, at least friends who play, who can help you to learn. Because otherwise you may find that you're holding it improperly, or you don't know how to hold the pick right, or your finger position isn't quite right, and your fingers are really hurting and you don't know quite how to do it. There's always a few tricks to help you along. But I've said it previously and I'll do it again. I can show a lot of the basics on how to play a tune in not much over a minute and a half. I've done it before. But for those who haven't seen me do it, I'll do it now. For those who've seen it before, well, I'll only take about a minute and a half to 2 minutes to do it. There'll be the guitar. The camera so we can see the angle a little better. And the easiest key to learn in is C. There's a C chord, G7, F, instead of just doing that, we do alternating bass. If you can do just that much, you can pretty much accompany yourself on a tune. But if you add a few touches like hammer-ons, country tunes, that's all the guy does. But if you want to be able to pick a melody, if you can do that, then the rest is pretty easy. And one time back in 1965, I was asked to do a beginner class. And at the end of 1 hour, 6 out of 10 kids in the class were picking out melodies by ear. And the other 4 probably could learn it quick enough with what I showed them. But you can do, if you can do what I showed you, then you can easily do. guitar lesson. If they can do that, then they're going to be pretty happy, and they will be able to learn a whole lot more. But you've gotten them excited and interested, and then they'll want to stay with it. John C., I use a case or whole humidifier for my acoustics. Please give me your advice on humidifying my Gibson archtop electric. Is it okay to use a case humidifier, or can it be harmful to the wiring and metal components? Well, if it is at the humidity that it ought to be, it's not going to be harmful to the wiring and electrical components, because you're not supposed to get it as damp as a wet basement where mold grows. But nothing beats just having a whole room humidifier, or having a humidification system on your central heat and air. And you'll find if you do that, you will feel better. Your skin will not get so dry, and your throat and nasal passages will not feel so dry, and you'll be less likely to get colds and the flu. You'll be healthier, and so will your guitar. Guitars and people happen to thrive in exactly the same temperature and humidity. So if you get your guitar humidification right, between 45 and 50% for the room humidification, you will feel healthier, and your guitar will too. And you won't have to worry about guitars having corroded wiring and other such problems. George, I recently played a couple of Larsen brothers parlor guitars from around 1910. The construction, tone woods, along with the ornate characteristics, look to be very high standards. In your opinion, could these type of guitars have rivaled the early guitars from Martin, especially in those very early years, in terms of being up to par, or was Martin still light years ahead? Well, the Larsen brothers guitars are extremely good. And as early as 1904, Larsen had a patent for laminated bracing designed for greater strength for use with steel strings. They were aiming for something different than Martin was at that time. Martin was not routinely doing much for steel strings until they started with Hawaiian guitars, which they did that as early as 1917. And then their style 217, starting in 1922, was routinely braced for steel, but it really wasn't until 1928 that most Martin guitars were braced specifically for steel strings, and it wasn't until late 29 that Martin came out with 14 fret necks. Before that, they were all 12 fret. But the Larsen brothers guitars are very good. Is their workmanship as neat and clean as a Martin? No. But is it very good? Yes. And do they sound really good? Well, they don't sound like a Martin. They sound like a Larsen. They had some different ideas. They built their guitars where the bracing had curvature to it, and the tops and backs were under tension, and then in other words, clamped such that there was a certain degree of stress tension on that, deliberately so. And violins, by the way, are done that way on the top. The bass bar on a violin has an arch that's such that when the top is glued to that bass bar, it actually does put a bit of tension on the top. And on cheap violins, they have the bass bar not as a separate piece of wood, but simply it's carved into the top. But it's the same piece as the top. It's not glued on, and they don't sound as good as the ones that have a separate bass bar and applies tension. At any rate, Larsen specifically advertised that their guitars were built under tension, and they were designed for steel strings. So they did that earlier than Martin. The Larsens have a great blues sound. They're a different sound from a Martin. I personally like Larsens. I have about 10 of them in my personal collection. But do I think that they are a better guitar than Martin? No. Do I think Martin was light years ahead? Well, Martin, back in 1910, was designing guitars pretty well exclusively for gut strings. And most of their players played classical or parlor music, but they were still beautifully crafted guitars. So again, it's comparing apples to pineapples. They're not the same, but they're both good. Larsen Brothers guitars are fine instruments. They are certainly collectible. They're not as well known as Martin, but I personally like them very well. But again, I like Martin's very well too. Different flavor, both good. I have a question from someone in Johannesburg, South Africa, named Keith. I purchased a Benedetto Cremona with serial number 13987-A from Gruhn Guitars in June of 2011, which was personally made by Bob Benedetto in 1987. The guitar was assessed by George to be in near mint condition. It has been meticulously maintained and cared for with proper humidification at all times in the original case. The guitar is in the same condition I received it in, and it is truly an instrument built for a professional player and collector alike. It was valued by George at $12,500 back then. And my question to George is, how much is it worth today in the USA or UK markets? Are these guitars as collectible as a Gibson Citation, their flagship model? This instrument was manufactured in the Savannah workshop when Bob was at the pinnacle of his lutherie art. I look forward to a response and send my warm greetings from Johannesburg, South Africa. Well, in 1987, Bob was building guitars by hand. The Benedetto guitars today are actually also made in Savannah, but they're in a factory. And Bob is retired from building. But the ones from the factory are not as valuable as the ones he personally handmade. But as with many luthiers, their very best instruments are not their earliest, but their latest. So would a guitar hand-built by Bob 20 years ago be the same quality as one he built in 87? The answer is no. And one built by him in the 70s, even more so. The earliest ones are not his best ones. The ones that he had the most experience with are his best ones. And that's true of almost any luthier. A company like Martin made great, great, great guitars in 1933, but they'd already been in business for 100 years. Whereas an individual luthier, their best are their latest. Now, value today, the archtop acoustic market, many of those really peaked as early as 1990 to 1995. And inflation adjusted, they're bringing less money now. Many of them now bring about the same price that they did as much as 25 years ago. They're still great guitars, but Angelicos, DeQuistos, Strombergs are actually, they were some of my favorite. I think they're the best rhythm guitars ever for archtop acoustic orchestral rhythm guitars, but they're not bringing as much money now as they did in the early to mid 1990s. And that's not even inflation adjusted. The Gibson Citation model was indeed the flagship model for Gibson, but that's a model made in very small quantities. It had a very high price when new. They also made a Super 4000 Chet Atkins model that was $20,000 wholesale when it was new. And these days, you'd be lucky to get $20,000 for one if you had it. And that was the dealer cost when it was new. Has your guitar gone up in value since the year 2011? No. Has it gone down? Also, no. It has stayed pretty well at the same value. What will it do in the future? Well, I left my crystal ball back in the office, but on other events in previous weeks, I've had it out here. And the one thing that I've always noted about my crystal ball, it's about yay big. It's a nice big crystal ball, about 10-inch diameter. And if you hold something right up on it where it's physically in contact, like I hold my watch right up to the crystal ball, and what you see is an enlarged, magnified picture of the crystal ball, of the watch, and it's right side up, and you can see it. It's great. It shows you what's here right now. But if you hold it away and you look through the crystal ball toward anything at a distance 3 feet or more, it flips the image. So it shows you that the world's all upside down. And lately, I often feel that that is just about what's going on, that the world has been flipped upside down. And that's a weird thing. One that from Jerry Wiksentowski, thanks for your response last week to my question regarding the comparison between the Gibson I'm back on a different computer. Sorry about the interruption. Anyway, going onward, Jerry Wiksentowski, thanks for your response last week to my question regarding the comparison between the Gibson Advanced Jumbo and the Martin D28. However, your answer didn't address an aspect that I was particularly interested in. Specifically, how would you characterize tone differences? My ears seem to indicate that the Martin might be said to have a more pure, direct tone, while the Advanced Jumbo emits a tone containing a roar or a growl. Would you agree? Or is my experience only the comparison between two isolated instruments? If you would agree to my characterization, do you think Gibson designers sought the tone of their guitar purposefully? Well, I've owned quite a few Advanced Jumbos over the years, but I've owned more D28 Martins because Martin made more of them than Gibson made of the Advanced Jumbo. But no, I don't characterize it that way. I think that there's a distinctly different Martin tone versus Gibson tone. I think that the harmonic spectrum of the Martin may be perhaps a bit broader than on the Gibson. And the Gibson may be a bit more focused. So far as having a growl, I don't necessarily see that or hear that. But they are sufficiently different that it's almost like trying to describe the difference in taste between straight chocolate ice cream and some chocolate chip or fudge ice cream versus or lemon and lime. I'm not quite sure I can verbally come up with a really good explanation. But in general, I think that the Martin has a somewhat more woody tone, if that makes any sense. But the best of the Advanced Jumbos are miraculously wonderful guitars. I think they're the best flat top Gibsons ever made. And the Martin D28 is also an amazing guitar, especially the pre-World War II ones from the 30s. The Advanced Jumbo was made from 36 through 39, and the Gibson was great then, and the Martins made during that same period are also miraculously good guitars. They're wonderful instruments. They're two different personalities, but they're both extremely good guitars, and I'm at a loss to really explain it in words other than maybe the Martin sounds a bit more woody. Dave Holler says 140 years, holy cow. So where is all the mahogany stock normally held? Well, the answer is that I never said that they were holding that stock for 140 years. That wood was harvested, cut the trees down 100 to 140 years ago, from about 1880 through 1920. And then they just moved on to South America where they started working. But they'd float the logs down the river and they'd lose as much as 30%. It would sink. They didn't have sonar to find it. They didn't have scuba gear to go after it. So it just stayed there. And that means that they don't have a whole heck of a lot of that wood now. They have whatever they've been able to dig up or basically find by sonar, have scuba diver go down, bring it up, attach a chain to it in a big balloon, bring it up, and then get it all the way back to the US from Belize. They don't have a gigantic warehouse filled with 140 years worth of wood. The river bottom still has some wood down there, but each year there's less, because every time they pull up a log, that's one less log down there. And they weren't just adding logs every year to the pile. They were doing that from about as early as 1850. They were starting some logging down there. And there's a few logs that seem to be about that old, but most of them are from about 1880 to 1920. But each time they pull one up, it's just that much less that's there, because they stopped logging in that area, stopped floating logs down the river so that they could sink. They stopped doing that about 1920. Steve Goldfield, I have a Wildwood Troubadour banjo, which is 2 or 3 pounds lighter than any of the 10 or so others of that model I have seen. I once showed it to Jason Romero, who used to work at Wildwood. He told me that the maple has a very wide range of densities, as the wood in my banjo is at the lower end, in which case lowering the mass of the banjo ring more. Well, yes, maple can vary considerably in weight, and it may be enough that it's noticeable. But I also strongly suspect that if it's the same maker and the same model banjo, and you actually weigh them on an accurate scale, that there's not going to be 2 or 3 pounds of difference. It might be 1 pound, conceivably maybe 1.5 pounds, but that would be a lot. But there's other factors involved, like what type tone ring. If it has the exact same tone ring, the weight of the tone rings ought to be consistent. Pre-World War II Gibson tone rings vary greatly in weight, but it's not random. They had several different tone ring patterns, and some were heavier than others. The master tone rings vary from not much over 2 pounds to a little over 3 pounds for the pre-World War II models. And wood can vary considerably in density. But again, I doubt seriously that it weighs that much different, but one would have to weigh it to be sure. Evan, what makes the 0028 Martin special, and how does it compare to the Martin D28? Well, the 0028 and the D28 of the same age feature the same wood, the same ornamentation, the same level of workmanship, but they differ in size. A D28 is a dreadnought size guitar. measuring 15 5/8 inches wide and 4 7/8 deep at the end pin, and has a 25.4-inch scale, and a 00028 14 fretter from the same time would be 15 inches wide and only 4 1/8 deep. And it's a different body shape. They sound different, and they will feel a bit different. They certainly, picking it up, you know right away, because the D feels a lot bigger. And they sound different. The 000 is great for finger picking, and it's fine for blues. The D28 is a terrific bluegrass and country guitar, but they're equal quality. They're just different, but they compare just fine so far as quality. But they're completely different beasts, and they do something different. It would be, but it's not a matter of good versus bad. It's going to be a matter of personal preference and what type of music you play. A question from Jim Betts: are the mid-1980s Martin D28 custom guitars comparable to the vintage D28s? Well, comparable, you know, one can compare them, but are they similar in quality? Depends what you mean by vintage. Some people consider 1950s vintage. Some others may consider 60s vintage. When I opened up my store, a 30-year-old guitar was 1940. But in 1970, January is when I opened. So 30 years would have been January 1940. Well, today we'd certainly view that as a vintage guitar. And back then we did too, because it was radically different from the new one. It was also way better than what was new in 1970. But today, a lot of people would think of a 1960 guitar as vintage. That would also be 60 years ago. But it's still not golden era. The pre-World War II Martin guitars, D28s, are amazing. And the absolute very, very most sought after for 14 fret D28s would be 1934 through late 1938, when they are forward shifted scallop bracing and have the 1 3/4 nut width. But even on up through the wartime, they were still herringbone trimmed, and they were still very good guitars, but where they don't bring as much money as that period of just 34 through late 38. The D28s made from 31 through 33 were 12 fret guitars, and they also are very highly sought after. But are the 1980s D28 custom guitars equivalent in quality to that? No. In fact, are the 1980s as good as what they make right now? The answer is no. In my opinion, Martin right now is building probably the best guitars they've done in the past 60 years. I don't claim that they are going to beat a 1937, but Martin is making some great guitars right now, and we sell a heck of a lot of them. We sell a very high percentage of our total Martin sales are on new Martin Sinker mahogany and other custom guitars. And we have more custom models which will be coming soon to give greater variety of custom shop Martins from Gruhn guitars. But even the standard factory issue non-custom Martins are still very good instruments today. And the D28s we're talking about of the golden era period of the 30s were not custom guitars. They were standard production models. But back then, standard production had a very high degree of handwork. There was no CNC equipment. They did have power tools, but a great deal of the work in neck shaping was done by hand with a draw knife. And they had very skilled craftsmen who knew how to do handwork. And Martin still has highly skilled people, especially in their custom shop. But even the standard factory models that are in the catalog are better guitars now than Martin has made in quite a while. And Martin's quality truly is something I admire. They are fine instruments that I am proud to represent. I still love the vintage, and I will still tell you that a good 1937 D28 or D18 or any other Martin of that period does bring more money than the equivalent new one, and there's reasons why. The golden era, in my opinion, has not been beaten or equaled, but they're coming remarkably close. There are new guitars now made by Martin and by other companies. Gibson and Fender are also making far better guitars now than they did 50 years ago. And many new guitars made today, also by some companies that didn't even exist 50 years ago. Taylor, Santa Cruz, a lot of these others, Bourgeois, Hudson Dalton, they didn't exist 50 years ago, but they're making good guitars now. And Preston Thompson, that's another example, fine guitars, but they weren't there 50 years ago. Still, these companies make fine instruments. Collings didn't exist 50 years ago, and they make great guitars. I still happen to love the new Martins, and I think the new custom shop Martins that we have are some of the finest new instruments I've ever played. But Martin is not alone in making good guitars these days. The craftsmanship today is in some ways a second golden era. There are more good makers today than ever before, and the major manufacturers are doing better instruments right now than they did 50 years ago. I'll look forward to tuning in with you next week. Send in questions. The more the merrier. I look forward to hearing from you. And in the meantime, keep in mind that George@guitars.com gets me. If you email me, George@guitars.com, I will get it, go straight to me, and I will respond. I look forward to hearing from you. Have a good one.